somebody was asking last time for recording, so I'll make it. So anyway, I was talking about geometry, cameras, lights, everything that's needed just to get a materials, everything that's needed to get a basic something rendered. So this sphere, as I turned on vertex models, notice that there's a line coming out of each vertex. Now, these vertices come together to make a face. And the normals stick off perpendicular from the face. So the way that these vertices are built to make this face aligns the vertices along the surface of this mesh. And so if you take the tangent, or if you take the perpendicular, that's what's known as the normal. So in this case, all the normals are pointing out. It's just the way that the vertices are aligned, and they kind of call it a winding to make a polygonal face. So you have to start at one side, and different computer packages do it differently as far as if it's clockwise or counterclockwise. But I think most of the time it's counterclockwise. So what that means is you take one vertice and a second one, and then a third one, in this case a fourth one, and then you come back to the fifth one. Notice as I was clicking them, they go counterclockwise. So if I go in this direction, it's clockwise. But the way that these vertices are listed out in a collection, in an array of this mesh, in this case, it's saying that this polygonal face is made up of these four. Technically, it only does triangles. There's two triangles here, but we're just sticking at high level right now. The way that this is wound, the way that the vertices are listed behind the scenes, designates the direction of those normals. And that designates which side of the polygonal face is actually renderable to the camera. So just gonna go see if I can find turn off back face coloring. That's it. Let me go in. All right, it's kind of it. Basically, you can't see the backside of a polygon. So in this case, if let me click off this thing. If I go into the sphere, I don't see anything. I go outside the sphere, I see it. And if I delete a section of it and click off of it, it looks invisible. But if I turn that back face culling back on, you can see it. It's not being hit by a light source. And if I create a light source, okay, here's real-time lighting. Is it illuminating? No, it should be coming from this side. I think that's just a render artifact. Because it's the back. Okay. So the way that, so notice how the light is coming off on the right-hand side, and it's hitting here. Notice how the inside of it is rendered the same. So they must have updated that a little recently. So it used to be that the whole back inside, if it's opposite to what the normals are doing, just doesn't get rendered. But in the game engine, you will never see that. It'll appear like this. So what's happening is the normals are all pointing out in the out way of the sphere. That's the side of the polygonal face that gets determined, like, oh, that's the real side. That's the real side we have to render. So it's too expensive to render both sides of the face. And normally, since these are just surfaces, they're not volumes, there's nothing inside of them, normally you'd only see one side. So, and in game engines, you might see that, like where if you're running around in the game and you get a little too close to the wall, you might start to see inside of it. So if I just turn back. So normally if you, if just pretend this boulder is starting a cliff or something, if you can get your character, maybe the collision meshes weren't set up the best, you might be able to peek your head inside the boulder, and all of a sudden it's like you can see through it into the rest of the world. That's because the inside of the boulder is not being rendered. And again, that's for optimization purposes, because 99.9% of the time, you never see inside it. So that's why the normals are important. You need to figure out which side of the mesh, which side of the polygonal face are we going to render to camera. Now, normals are also important in, see if I can step back a few steps and big back to the sphere. All right. Normals are also important. So it seems like since I created a camera, a light source, since I deleted it, it didn't bring back that kind of default light that was sitting there at first. So I just have to create a light source, and just you can start to see with these. This symbol means camera. This symbol means a polygonal mesh. This symbol means a light source. And usually, I think that means like a grouping, like stuff. In any case, what I'm going to do is this whole sphere is supposed to be rendered softly. So I'm going to take this edge and I'm going to harden it. Let me see what it does to the render. Kind of. So you're only supposed to really harden edges where there's like a sharp change, like say a corner of a desk or something. For the soft sphere, you usually don't want to harden an edge because it wouldn't have that kind of hard edge, that difference in lighting. Maybe this is like almost like you could see where like you could get that indent from like a tennis ball or something. You might be able to like feel that like line around the ball with hardening the edge. What I really wanted to do that for was to show you that hardening and softening the edges can affect the lighting on an object. And what that hardening and softening is doing is, notice we have more normals here. Notice on the vertex normals on this object, there's only one normal per vertex. But where the hard edge is, we have two normals per vertex now. I just want to take a look at the face normals just to see, just to confirm that they haven't changed. Yeah, so the face normal, notice how the face normal is coming up the center of the polygonal face. And again, they're perpendicular to the face. And it's this normal combination of the light source direction and the face normal that figures out how much a face, a polygonal face, should be lit up. So notice that this light source is coming down and hitting here and lighting up mostly here and not so much over here. Now for each light source, every model that's affected per light must go through each light and be like, okay, this face is pointing, does a vector calculation, says this one is pointing almost like 180 degrees from this, meaning they're pointing toward each other, meaning this face is pointing up toward the light source, meaning it should receive 100% of the light, whatever the color is, whatever the illumination is, right? It should receive it. Down here, this farthest away normal is almost pointing in parallel in the same direction as the light source, meaning it's pointing away. It's pointing, it should not be receiving light. It's in a hidden area in relation to the light. But if I were to move the light, its direction, its normal direction, you see, changes, and then it recalculates based on the face normals. Now, direction, we haven't gotten to lights yet, but notice how moving a direction like this is doing it. It's like trying to mimic like a faraway source of the sun. So moving it doesn't mess with it. It's the rotating that changes it. So that's what the whole important thing with normals are. Face normals are calculated from its surrounding vertex normals. So then that's the last thing I think I have to talk about is that, for example, this normal here looks at its vertices. Based on how the vertices were wound, ordered, we know which direction the face is pointing. And in this case, we take the average of these four, and that is the direction that the face is pointing. Now, notice here, we don't have a shared vertex normal. So for this face to this face here to this face here, notice they share these vertices normals here, right? So this normal takes these four, and we get this nice averaged face normal. This face normal takes these four. It's just the bottom of these two, because there's two normals. This one that's a little bit lower is relating to this face. These two that are a little pointed up higher is relating to this face. Anyway, this face and this face is sharing these two. So they have like a shared edge. So there's like a blending of normals. It does like it calculates the average, so we figure out the shading of the face, right? Now, each face is almost the way that shaders work, computer graphics work, is that first the shader goes through the model, the mesh that it's given, and it looks at the vertex positions. And from that, it can say, it actually loops through all the vertex positions, but I'm only kind of interested in these four right now. And it can determine that there's a face in this area of the screen, a polygon face. And then it passes that information to the fragment shader, vertex shader, fragment shader. And the fragment shader actually looks at all the pixels on the monitor. And for each little pixel in the monitor, it says, oh, this polygon face is inheriting that pixel. And so that fragment shader knows for this little pixel on the monitor, this polygon is sitting there. So I should inherit this color and add it to my pixel, the monitor pixel. Now, when a polygon kind of inherit or overlaps a part of a monitor's pixel, part of in the fragment shader, you know, that pixel, that fragment will inherit a certain amount of color from this polygon face and a certain amount of color from this polygon face. So since they're like blended together, the colors are really similar and there's no crazy changes in the normal, you don't really notice much. But from this face to this face, we do notice because there's quite a change in the normals. If I click off for a second, notice how this is kind of get dark and what have you, and then all of a sudden it gets really bright. Well, that's because this, when it goes through the vertex shader, I see you have a question. Let me finish this and I'll get to you. When we process this face in the vertex shader, and looks at the vertices, so this little, there's a face here from the vertices, and it's this color, and then it gets, that information gets passed to the fragment shader. It says, oh, this little part of the computer monitor, this little pixel needs to be colored whatever this material color and this object that's been lit had a color added to by light source needs to be this. But if we move just a little bit up into another fragment, another pixel on the monitor, the vertex shader says, oh, we're reading from this face, this polygon. In this polygon, the face normal is taking this and this one and this vertex normal and this one, these four, which you notice there's a slight difference compared to this one. So this one is pointing up a little bit more. Based on how the lighting information is coming in, there's that much of an angle difference, which contributes. It's more directly oriented toward the one light source than this one is. And so just that angle difference toward that one light source is making this one face, polygonal face, a little bit more brighter. And so when we move from this little part of the polygon, and it says, oh, this is my color to the fragment shader on this pixel on the monitor, we just move a little bit up. All of a sudden, we're in a new polygon face. And it has just enough of a difference in that normal angle because I hardened that edge, which means this polygon has its own vertex normals. This polygon has its own vertex normals for these two out of four. Just enough that it changes the lighting, which makes it give it a hard edge. Again, usually use that when there's a big abrupt change in the geometry, like the corner of a tube.
Hey, Prof, I had a question.
Yeah.
So if we give one certain face its own set of vertices and then change the color of that face, will it affect the faces around it too?
So you can give, let me change the direction of light back to white, see if this is what you're talking about. So it is like a neutral light source. Let me go back and soften this edge so that we're not seeing that. And let me select this one face here, and I'm gonna assign it a new material. Since we're working with Lambert, so I'll just give it a Lambert, and I'll make that color red. And is this what you're saying? Can you assign a material to just one face?
Yeah. That and also like if we give it its own set of vertices, then it doesn't change the ball's face at all, right? Other than that specific area.
Yeah. So it's common to you can like duplicate just that face, and you could do stuff to it so that it's not like directly impacting the rest of the model. So that's in the modeling techniques that you'll learn from Chris.
Okay. My other
Yes, you
question
can
would
duplicate.
be, so essentially like if the vertices were not to be shared, then in that case that red color would blend in with the panels around it too, or
So I'm just assigning a material to a different material to this face. Vertices are more, so I wouldn't worry about materials right now because you're going to use a really advanced painting tool called Substance Painter, where you're not really assigning materials and painting right on the model like this. I'm doing this just for kind of like that's not like a real proper industry workflow anymore. It's kind of out of date. I'm just showing you it to understand how computer graphics are working.
okay. Thank you.
But
Sorry, it's just a random question I had.
yeah, you're talking about how like this red color can like bleed over into these other polygonal faces. And that's during the painting tool. Like you'll use like a brush, and you can like you don't even have to think about the geometry really when you're painting. You're just thinking about the materials and the different areas that you want to paint materials onto. But you're going to be using like more of an artist tool, so you're not going to have to think about behind the scenes what's happening as much. I would think more of vertices as the core component, the core definition of geometry. You can't have geometry without first defining the vertices, but vertices don't mean anything by themselves. You can't like, well, in this package, you can't just have vertices and not have the affiliated edges and faces. They all kind of come along for the ride. So notice I can go into this face, I can delete it. And I don't have a face here, but I still have my vertices and edges. So a face or a polygonal face is kind of like secondary to the idea of an edge. And an edge is kind of secondary to the idea of a vertex. Everything comes down to the vertices. And you can't really just like create and delete vertices like that. You kind of have to, so I can like select this edge and say edit mesh, delete edge vertex, and it will delete the vertices and the affiliated edges. But notice that the big, and instead of having twice as many polygonal faces, now we have half in that area, but we've also lost, notice how our curve is kind of been removed. The thing isn't as curvy. We've lost definition. So sometimes you want to add, sometimes you want to remove, and it really affects the structure, the way that the surface is defined. But notice that I didn't just delete vertices. Now, when you use like a super advanced tool like Houdini with the nodes and the code, you can manipulate the structures a lot more low level. You can actually go in there and you can just make a mess of everything. You can delete vertices, this, that, but it'll make a complete, if you don't know what you're doing, you make just a complete mess of everything. Because again, they rely on each other like a hierarchy. And the vertex is really the most primitive kind of definition of the geometry. And it doesn't do anything by itself, really. You need the combination of all the vertices and the edges and the polygonal faces to end a result, get something rendered to the screen. So I'm just kind of giving you like a big overview at a lower level, just because Chris is just going to dive in and he's going to be like, here's the gizmos, here's the tools, let's start learning the modeling techniques, let's start extruding and adding edges, edge loops, and he's going to be focused on more like the technique of modeling, where I'm just trying to get a better understanding of what's happening underneath the hood. So yeah, you can assign different materials to different faces. And you can start to get some like interesting things going. Like I can kind of select a few loops. And I can assign that the red material and say, hey, that's pretty interesting. It's starting to look like something. But, it's nothing compared to the workflow that you will be learning. You'll get much stronger, more realistic looking results with what you're going to learn with Chris. And I guess speaking of materials real quick, these are what are called Lamberts. It's the most these days the most basic shader. It just looks at diffuse coloring. It just says, hey, here's the normals, here's the light source. There's some basic, what they call a diffuse color. Diffuse or albedo or color all mean the same thing. The basic color of an object. Beyond that, there's like the transparency, there's the specular highlights and all this other stuff that, so blends and it's the companion one to that. Blend and Fawn are like the next level up. They get like a shiny, you can add like a shiny reflectivity. So if I take the red one, I don't know if I can just upgrade material like that. Let's take this Lambert to make it a blend. Yeah. Sounds great. Notice the reflection. I have a reflection now of the slight source. This is known as a specular highlight, specular shading. Notice it's only on the red. there's no specularity on the gray because that's a Lambert. Doesn't support specular shading. So there's a million different types of shaders. You just need to be concerned with the fact that game engine these days use stuff called like standard shaders or physically based shaders and standard shader, and that just means it's PBR, it's physically based rendering, it's got all the bells and whistles to try and make it look realistic. Is there any questions? That knowledge, it's not really like practical, but all the times I've learned this and all the times I've taught students, it seems like that's kind of like the nice deep underlying low level stuff that kind of helps you to understand what the hell all this thing is about.
Yeah, it's nice to like know the basics somewhat. I'm gonna have to probably play around with it a bit more on our time to really get it.
Yeah,
So
that's right.
thank you.
So most of this class, you just have to play the videos, and you're gonna like stop the videos every 10, 20, 30 seconds to do what Chris does because you haven't done it before. So trust me, for every hour of his video, it's gonna take you like 3 hours to complete. I'm just trying to like ground you out so everything isn't such a weird big mystery. I'll just quickly say that like the first tool he's probably going to introduce. If I select some of these edge rings and I extrude, this is probably the first thing he's going to have you do. So extrusion is like the first thing you learn to start making more complicated models. Right. Adding edge loops to add more definition, more resolution, and then doing extrusions in or out is cool. So as I go back, oh, really 15 minutes in. All right. I guess just to wrap this up, if you look at this, shrink this all down. We just have the scene. We talked about the light source, the main camera. I guess I could bring the environment back. And if I open up with these models, something to note is that the green lines around it is the collision mesh so that you can't walk through things. And notice how it's much simpler. It's almost like a cage around the objects. And if I click on one of these objects, this happens to be like up here. That's great. These are objects and the blue ones are prefab. So they're more like, as you work in the game engines more, this has like a transform, gives it its like position information. This is the mesh. The mesh filter is like the actual geometry, the FBX file. The mesh renderer is like, what materials do I put on this? In this case, this polygonal fantasy kingdom material is this, and this gives it this like wooden feel. Notice standard shader, albedo metallic, normal map, a lot of stuff. And there's the mesh collider. In this case, it's using the same mesh, so you don't really see the green lines because they're sitting right on top of the mesh. It's a pretty heavy mesh collider. Or usually the mesh collider, the collider's mesh is not as complicated as the render mesh because it's expensive physics-wise to calculate that all. But I guess the player can come out and walk on this, so whatever. But that's the parts of this object. And just as I cycle down, I just want you to note how many objects are created or duplicated and reused to make this advanced scene. Bridges and big sections of ground are just being reused. So they're not even using the train system. They're just like reusing big chunks that they modeled out. But all these were done in some type of content package. Oh yeah, you have to. Yep. So this stuff doesn't sink in until I mess around. That's correct. You have to get your hands really dirty in programming and 3D modeling, and you just have to do it, get into it. Then I'll turn this back on. Just note just how many objects there are. It's just an overwhelming amount, but you focus on one at a time. You know, like a whole team did this with professionals. But if you just take one part of the model at a time, say this is just a floor sectional, and if you just look at its go find it in the project view. You can actually bring this file back into content package. It is just a 3D model. Where is the? This is the mesh. He says a little render view of it. Should be able to grab this. And I think I can just drag it in. Yep. This is how basic the geometry is for 1/4 sectional of the ceiling. You know, and so it was purposely designed where you could duplicate it, rotate it around the center pivot point, and build floors very quickly for this tower. Just notice the geometry is very simple, and it's really the when it's duplicated out many times and very nice materials created onto it, that it looks really good. But behind the scenes, it's very basic. Got some there. Yeah, I just wanted to show you it's not that crazy looking. And I guess one last thing, and I'll let you go, is the relationship of the model to its material, to its texture, is known as the UVs. So X, Y, Z for position information. UV is another coordinate space, and it dictates how does a 3D model get cut up and laid out in a 2D space so that the 2D texture can get painted all over the model. This is a huge texture file for many different parts. So it's just probably like a little sections. So that's why if I zoom out, yeah, it's little. So these are more advanced workflows. But here's the space, this big square right here. Inhabits this whole texture space. And it's just saying this little mesh, you unwrap it and it's going to sit in this little section of the texture map, and that's how it's going to inherit this color information, which means it's just this little thing down right around here somewhere. It's very small. I mean, this is a 4K by 4K texture map. It's huge. But just this little thing right here is being painted from this little thing. And you'll learn about that later. All right. That's all I got. So is there any questions? Yeah. So these, I say this all the time in my 201 class. The reason that my classes are project-based, even coding and what have you, is you can't just sit back and watch. This stuff makes no sense. It's not It's not a theory-based class. None of this stuff is. You can't just like read a textbook on the theory of like how thermodynamics works. It's not like the same thing. You really just gotta build a lot of stuff, and a lot of stuff is not going to look good. Or if it's coding, it's just not going to run well. But that's okay, because at least it's built and you can learn a lot. Remember that quote I showed you from Ira Glass? So I really really a majority of this class is outside class time. I'm just getting you grounded. We'll be going into emissive lighting topics. Not really the theory behind it, but some of the parts of the structure that Chris builds ends up having an emissive quality to it. Like they're glowing, either it's magical or like radioactivity or something, and you will be painting in the emissive channel. So if I go over to Unity and click on one of these shaders, you will be filling in this emission. This will be turned on. It'll be a texture map connected to emission. It will be like making stuff look like they're glowing. But again, it's just all these are parts of a shader. Let's say that give it a surface characteristics, and emissive light is just another one. On top of the emissive quality of the shader, sometimes people add VFX, like little particle systems that are kind of like bouncing like little sparks up on top of it to make it look like it's more active, and maybe put a few extra lights, special lights around it and stuff. And all of that combined makes it feel like it's really has its own energy source. But that's how they make stuff look emissive, right? But it's really just turning this on and connecting a texture map to it, which Substance Painter does all that kind of for you. Yeah, there's a million topics. Like realistically, a really in-depth program has like a class just on modeling, and a class just on lighting, and a class just on rendering and animation. And it just keeps, it's just the topics go. Computer graphics is a massive, massive field. Yeah, you will break it. It's all right. You just reset it. All right, so you're free to go. Sometimes people want to wait till themselves to ask a question. That's what you need to do. I'm going to stop recording.